My name is Lucinda. I am 21 years old, and this was the moment when I felt that adult life had finally begun to draw me into its nets. I have just graduated from the third year of art college, the very educational institution that I once dreamed of. But let me tell you, it was damn hard. 3 years filled not only with lectures and assignments, but also with a feeling of complete isolation that has haunted me since childhood. Before I go into all these details, I'll tell you a little bit about myself. I grew up in a house where I never felt at home. My parents, Tom and Sarah, have always made it clear that my older sister Emily is their golden child. She was 4 years older than me, and from the very first day I was born, she was a thorn in my eye. Emily always knew how to make me suffer, how to turn my most innocent joys into pain. Since childhood, she teased me, broke my toys, jokingly knocked me down, and at the same time said with a straight face, "It's just sisterly love, don't worry." My parents laughed when I complained and always replied, "Oh, there are sisters like that," as if this chaos and suffering were part of the inevitable family harmony. But it wasn't normal. I felt it. I felt that something was wrong inside my family. All the attention was on Emily, and I was just a shadow that existed on the periphery of their ideal picture of life. I often think back to those years when the world for me existed only in a few rooms of our house, and every corner was associated with memories of how I tried to fight for attention, for a place where I would be accepted. Emily didn't need it. She was bright, successful, beloved. While I, despite all my efforts, remained only a shadow that wandered in her reflection. When I was 14 years old, I fell in love for the first time. His name was Jake, and he was, without any exaggeration, the sweetest creature in the world. He was older than me, he was in high school, and I, shy and insecure, spent hours painting his portraits. It was like a kind of secret bliss for me, my little refuge from the cruel reality. I hid my drawings under the mattress, confident that no one would find them. But, of course, not Emily. One day, as expected, she came across my drawings. I remember her standing on the threshold of my room, with her eyes full of mockery, holding my paintings in her hands. She didn't say a word, just smiled faintly. It was a smile that made me feel like something inside me had burst. She never left me alone. It wasn't just a joke. Emily literally enjoyed destroying my dreams, my little joys. She showed the drawings to Jake at the school ball. He didn't know what to do with them and just threw them into a corner. It was the end. I will never forget his face when he looked at me, not with contempt, but with that deep, palpable detachment that hurt much more than any words. Since then, I've learned to hide my feelings. I hid them under layers of silence, imagining other worlds where Emily wasn't, where these sophisticated torments weren't, where I could be myself. Art has become a way for me to escape. When I went to college, I immersed myself in drawing and painting so deeply that they became my only friends. Here, among the paints and canvases, I felt alive. I could be anyone. I could create worlds where anything was possible. Where I could be free. However, despite all my independence, my family continued to be my stumbling block. Emily and her perfect life were everywhere anyway. My parents were proud of her, her successes, her career, her everything. And despite the fact that I naively thought that I would become someone significant after college, I understood that for them I would remain a shadow, a child who was not paid attention. But I wasn't worried anymore. Art has opened doors for me that I couldn't even imagine before. Here, among my works, I found my real home. "Tom and Sarah, I need you to promise me something," Grandma said, lying on her bed, emitting a faint light from the window, which was now shrouded in evening darkness. "Promise me that you will pay for Lucinda's last year of education. She needs to finish her education." My parents, sitting next to me, nodded almost solemnly. Mom, as always, gently and lovingly replied, "Of course, Mom, we promise." The father added, as usual, with restraint, "We promise." But I knew those promises were just words. My parents' actions have always been overshadowed by their empty speeches. Grandma died a week later, and soon we gathered at her house to listen to the reading of the will. Once in that old house, which seemed to hold the memory of our entire family history, I felt like a stranger. It was huge, with high ceilings and dark wooden floors that had once creaked under my parents' feet, but now held only the darkness of abandonment. When the lawyer read the will, I felt my chest tighten. "She left her house to Tom and Sarah," the lawyer said, his voice stern and unbiased. My hand instinctively reached for the box where I kept my memories of my grandmother, but suddenly, as if by fate, I noticed Emily leaning towards the lawyer, staring at him impatiently. "And the jewelry? What is it?" she asked. "What did Grandma leave me?" There was no hint of sadness in her voice, just a dry expectation, as if she already knew the answer. "Grandma left the jewelry to Emily and Lucinda," the lawyer said, and I saw Emily instantly grab the diamond tiara, leaving a cold smile on her face. "I'll take it," she said. "Lucinda can get the ring she doesn't have." These words, simple but filled with venom, seemed to bind the air. I could have objected, but I didn't. In the end, it didn't matter to me. Yes, the diamond ring was beautiful, but I didn't need these jewels. I didn't crave glitter. I longed for something else: freedom. Freedom from this house, freedom from Emily, freedom from my parents. I nodded, and Emily carried the tiara to her room with a triumphant smile. However, I still took the ring. I just didn't want to argue with her. I didn't want to quarrel. I put it in a safe deposit box, in a place where it could disappear forever, because it meant nothing to me. Unlike what was going on inside me. Unlike my desire to find my way, which was so far away from this family. When I went to college, I didn't expect to be able to make friends with anyone. My life was gray, expressionless, as if frozen in some time, until the moment came when I met Zoya. She was as strange as I was, and in her eyes I read the same sense of isolation that I felt. She was a punk rocker, a person whose personality was vividly embodied in her art. She drew abstractions, those that could cause a storm of emotions in anyone who looked at them. Marcus was different. He was quiet, silent, but when he created his sculptures, they became alive. Such breathtaking jobs made me forget about everything in the world. It was freedom embodied in the material. They didn't worry about who I was. They didn't try to squeeze me into the framework that was so familiar to me at home. In college, I felt like I was finding my own world, a world where I could be myself and not the shadow that always followed Emily. Zoya and Marcus, although completely different, have made me a part of their world. I began to understand that real freedom is not only the opportunity to live by my own rules, but also the ability to be true to myself, despite the opinions of others. Meanwhile, I was forgetting about the ring in the safety deposit box, as one forgets about things that were never really important. My life did not depend on brilliance, but on what I could create, on what I could become. And perhaps it was this feeling, the feeling that there was more ahead than the usual worries about jewelry and family expectations, that finally began to define me. "This is Richard," Emily said, stepping forward as always, as if she were on a pedestal surrounded by a halo of perfection that she had created for herself. He emerged from the shadows, tall and elegant, his black hair neatly combed, and a mysterious smile played on his face. I couldn't help but notice how handsome he was, but this perfect appearance of his seemed to be nothing more than a mask hiding something much more complicated. "Isn't he dreamy?" she added with that indescribable tinge of admiration in her voice that so irritated me in her way of speaking. Richard smiled politely at me and held out his hand. "Nice to meet you, Lucinda," he said with a warm intonation that, despite its affability, left me with a strange feeling of understatement. "I've heard so much about you." I shook his hand, while mentally wondering what exactly he could have heard. If it was about how I was probably forever in the shadow of my older sister, his idea of me could be quite superficial, as could his acquaintance with Emily. Knowing her, He probably heard something not flattering at all, most likely nothing good. The next morning, I woke up to loud chatter coming from downstairs. Emily hosted a breakfast in honor of her engagement, and our parents, as always, were ready to support her in this new stage of her life. Downstairs, she was sitting surrounded by her bridesmaids, all beaming and full of selfish delight. The sounds of their conversations came through the thin walls, and I lay in my room and listened to what they were discussing. I found out that Emily broke up with another guy. It happened a few months ago, but she continued to discuss it as if with excessive drama, telling how she suffered and how nobly that young man left her. As it turned out, he was associated with some kind of dangerous crowd, and Emily's whole family was horrified by this, almost breathing a sigh of relief that she had been saved from this barbarism. "Thank God you're listening to us, honey," Mom said when Emily told another story about her ex. "Richard is much more suitable for you. His family is so well off that you can't even imagine." She continued, patting Emily's hand as if blessing her new choice. I couldn't help but roll my eyes. Of course, this was what they were most concerned about: security and social status. They did not even notice how superficially they evaluate people, only by external signs, without delving into the depth of their personalities. Emily was perfectly familiar with this art of manipulation, creating perfect paintings for others to always be the center of attention. What matters to her is the appearance, not the reality. And, of course, Richard fit perfectly into her worldview. I sat in my room and, trying not to listen to their endless conversations, I thought about what was happening in my life right now. No matter how hard I tried to shut it all out, I couldn't escape the fact that my sister and her world somehow, willy-nilly, remained a part of my life. And Richard, with his impeccable manners and pretentious smile, will also be a part of this story. A little later, when I went downstairs to have breakfast, Richard was already standing next to Emily, holding hands with her, like a couple ready for marriage. They looked perfectly harmonious, and this perfect, almost director's shot with their golden smiles under the nails of sunlight, almost completely absorbed everything that was around. But at that moment, I realized that I didn't care. This is their life, their choices. I didn't want to be a part of this picture, this idealized life, which, as it seemed to me, was full of falsehood. The seconds became minutes, and I felt like every morning in this house, filled with ringing laughter and endless congratulations, each time more and more severs the thread of connection between me and this world. Maybe I would just be happy if I could forget about it all and focus on my own quest, but I couldn't. I couldn't afford it. There was silence in the room, and in that deathly silence I couldn't believe my ears. Everything my father just said sounded like a terrible betrayal. "But you promised Grandma," I whispered, almost not believing that I was saying these words. Tears began to fill my eyes, pressing heavily on my chest, but I tried not to show my weakness. Emily, as always, did not miss the opportunity to demonstrate her ruthlessness. "Oh, please, no one cares about promises made to some half-witted old lady," she laughed, her voice laced with contempt. There wasn't even the slightest hint of pity in those words, and they stabbed me like a cold knife in the back. I stood up so abruptly that the chair next to me fell to the floor with a loud thud. "How dare you talk about Grandma like that?" I shouted, my eyes wide with rage and my breathing ragged. "Enough." His father's angry shout rang out, and his voice echoed through the room like thunder. "Lucinda, you have a choice, the ring or your education." He shouted, not hiding his irritation, as if he wasn't telling his daughter this, but some strange girl he barely knew. I felt the world crumbling around me. Everything that seemed important turned out to be nothing in front of their demands. I stood as if in a stupor, and their faces flashed before my eyes: my father's anger, my mother's disappointment, Emily's smug smile, her imaginary satisfaction that she had defeated me once again. At that moment, I realized that I had lost again. Everything I've ever tried to achieve, everything I hoped for, has turned out to be meaningless again. I was trapped. With shaking hands, I took off the necklace that held the key to the safe, where the ring was lying, the very ring that I didn't need. I handed it to Emily, feeling the cold metal cling to my skin, leaving a strange mark in the shower. She took it without looking at me, with a smile that was full of superiority. I couldn't look at her smug face anymore. The next morning, after the incident with the ring, I decided not to leave this question unanswered. Emily couldn't just win. I cornered her in the kitchen as she sipped her morning coffee in her usual manner, enjoying her victory. I looked at her with a hard look and, feeling my heart beating in my chest, asked, "When exactly is your wedding?" Trying to keep at least a small amount of dignity in this situation. Emily looked up from her coffee without answering immediately, and the same smug smile played on her lips that always slipped when she tried to humiliate me. She took another sip, enjoying the moment, and only then said, "Oh, it's none of your business, Lucinda, but you can be sure that everything will be perfect." This response was so typical of her that I could barely keep from screaming. Emily never thought about other people's feelings, she was always sure she was right. I stood there, feeling a new storm brewing inside me. All I could do was look at her smirk and realize that at that moment I was nothing again. Emily always won, and maybe that was her only goal in life, to outshine me, to show everyone that she was the best, even if it required the complete destruction of me as a person. But I couldn't stay away any longer. In this endless game, where there was always more of her than me, I still began to feel that something was awakening inside me. "But you promised, you swore." I blurted out with such force that the words almost pierced the silence like sharp needles. I couldn't believe these words were coming from the people who were my parents. They were promises. They promised my grandmother that they would give me a chance that I could finish my studies. But everything turned out to be false, empty, like everything else in my life. Mom, despite my storm, only said dismissively, "Emily needs more." These words aroused an avalanche of rage in me. "I'm sure you'll figure something out," she added, as if the question wasn't important. "Just go and make sure that we don't hear those whines anymore." Emily, in turn, was still laughing. Her laugh was cruel, full of mockery, sounding so that its echo made my nerves explode. I couldn't stand her satisfied smile, her self-confidence, her cold arrogance. The moment I realized there was nothing else to do, I rushed to her. It happened before I could figure out exactly what I was doing. I grabbed her by the hair, pulled her towards me forcefully, as if that was all I could do. Emily was screaming, her voice breaking in an anxious and hysterical way, but at that moment it didn't matter to me. I was blind with rage. Suddenly, everything exploded. Screams, panic. Dad pulled me away, his face flushed with anger. He was shouting, his voice was like a storm. "Enough is enough," was his instruction. But it didn't matter anymore. I couldn't stay here anymore, among these people. "Lucinda, get out of this house right now," he said, and there was such coldness in his voice, such determination, that I couldn't object. I could not. I took a look at their faces, and there was nothing there to hold me back. All my life, all my struggles, all those years when I was trying to find my worth, meant nothing in their eyes. I ran to my room, not knowing what to do, where to go. Throwing everything I had into my bag, I ran out of the house. My cheeks were wet with tears, and I couldn't stop. I didn't know where I was going, but the only thing I could do was run. I knew that I would never return to this house again. He was a stranger, with cold walls, with false promises, with betrayals that became part of my existence. Without realizing how much time had passed, I found myself at the door of Zoe's house. She's been my friend since freshman year. I couldn't go any further, I had nowhere to go, and, as always, Zoya accepted me without any questions. When I entered, I felt better, as if I had left a piece of pain outside her house. I hardly left her guest room for the next few days. I sat there, absorbed in my pain, alternating endless bouts of tears with a blank stare fixed on one point. The walls, which seemed so alien, became my only shelter. Zoya tried her best to comfort me, but I was inconsolable. Every word she said was perceived as an empty sound, because everything that I had experienced could not disappear in an instant. A week has passed, and this haze of pain still wouldn't let go of me. It was hard for me to concentrate, hard to think about anything other than what had happened. The world seemed divided into two poles: my home, which now seemed distant and hostile, and a small corner in Zoe's house where I was safe but still felt lost. I wasn't the same person I used to be. Something had changed inside me, and I couldn't figure out how to move on. Emily, Dad, Mom, it was all a part of my life, but this life seemed alien to me now. How could you build a future when everything you once knew crumbles in a moment? I sat in the silence of the room, and only thoughts, like an eclipse, engulfed me. Jake must have seen the desperation in my eyes, because finally he nodded, sighing heavily. "Okay, I'll see what I can do," he said, and although his words were calm, I caught a note of concern in his voice, as if he wasn't sure he could help himself. A few days later, Jake showed up again, handing me a small USB drive. He said with a slight, almost imperceptible tension, "You didn't get this from me, okay?" I nodded, although I didn't really understand what he meant at all. She gratefully accepted the gift, but at the same time cast a glance at it with trembling hands, then hurriedly went back to her dorm room. My heart was pounding when I connected the drive to my laptop. The long seconds of waiting seemed endless, but finally the screen filled with what I was so afraid to see. I started the video file and hardly breathed when the picture started to appear on the screen. It was a video shot in the very house where we once lived, where I spent my childhood. Emily, as if hiding nothing, was clearly handing over the jewelry. My heart stopped at what I saw. She was holding in her hands the very jewelry that had been given to her by her grandmother's will. But that was just the beginning. I watched as she turned to leave, and at that moment a man entered the frame. He came up to her with a smile, and there was something like triumphant pleasure in her eyes that made me shudder. When she hugged him and kissed him passionately, I couldn't believe my eyes. It wasn't just a gesture, it was a moment that should have remained hidden from everyone. Richard, I thought, but something didn't add up. I leaned closer to the screen, trying to make out his face, and at that moment the man turned slightly and I saw him. My heart skipped a beat. I gasped, and for a moment the world went dark around me. It was him, the same ex-boyfriend of Emily, with whom our parents forced her to break up a few years ago. He was a man with criminal connections, and his image remained in my memory as something sinister. At that moment, I realized what was happening. Emily, as it turned out, had not only broken her grandmother's promise, but was probably playing a much dirtier game than I could have imagined. I leaned back, gasping with resentment and horror. My thoughts were confused, but one thing became clear: Emily had sold precious jewelry. I was looking at the screen where she was still kissing this man, and the thought was spinning in my head: this ring, this is Grandma's ring. What did you do with it, Emily? I felt anger begin to boil in my chest. It was a betrayal on every level. She didn't even hide what she was doing, as if it didn't matter. There was not a drop of regret in her eyes, only a thirst for power and comfort, which she had been looking for so long. And all those jewels, all those promises, it was just a way for her to get more without thinking about the consequences. But what should we do now? I couldn't believe that Emily had betrayed not only our grandmother so easily, but all of us. I was sitting in a dark room, in complete silence, and it seemed that I was losing something important for the last time: my own place in this family. "I'm really sorry that we all had to distance ourselves from Lucinda," Aunt Laura began, her voice sounding cold and almost mechanical. "She has become quite greedy and unworthy of our family name." The room was instantly filled with noise, a multitude of voices that simultaneously tried to shout over each other. Someone supported me, and someone, as always, sided with my parents, as if it was something predetermined, as if I was to blame for my own life. I could hear the whispers behind my relatives, but my gaze remained focused on Emily. I felt the pain and anger accumulated over the years begin to burst out. Raising my voice, I almost shouted, "I have something to say." My words made everyone in the room quiet down, and the tension became almost palpable. All eyes were on me, and I couldn't go back. It was the moment when everything I was hiding had to come out. I turned to Emily, her face as calm and smug as ever, but I knew she was feeling this tension too, this realization that I was now holding something important in my hands. "Congratulations, sis, on your pregnancy," I said, almost sarcastically. "But I have to ask, why aren't you wearing Grandma's tiara and ring?" I looked at her face, noticing how pale it turned when my words reached her ears. Emily froze, her gaze turned blank, as if she expected someone to open the door to a new world in front of her, but she didn't know what exactly would be behind that door. Then her mother-in-law intervened, trying to shift her attention to something less dangerous. "Now that you mention it, it's been a long time since you've seen this beautiful ring, Emily. Honey, where is it?" Her voice was soft, but with a clear hint of curiosity. Emily stuttered, trying to find the words to justify herself, but I already knew the answer. I sent them for restoration. "They needed cleaning," she said, but her words sounded like a lie, even if she believed it herself. I nodded, slowly pulling my phone out of my pocket. At that moment, all eyes turned to me again, and I felt everything around me freeze. That was my moment. I plugged my phone into the TV, holding back a smile, knowing that now I could show her everything. There was silence in the room, and I pressed the play button. A video appeared on the screen. First, the footage from the security cameras from the pawn shop was shown, which Jake managed to hand over to me. In these shots, Emily, with that smug smile, handed over jewelry, including her grandmother's ring, imperceptibly putting it in the hands of a man who was clearly not from our circle of acquaintances. This man looked suspicious. His face was partially hidden, but his gait and demeanor gave him away as someone I had once seen in the company of people with criminal connections. When the video ended, there was dead silence in the room. I heard someone coughing, and then a faint, almost inaudible sound came from the corner of the room as Emily lost the ability to speak. I saw her face fall and her eyes turn pale to a marble shade. I waited. I knew she was going to panic now. She knew she couldn't justify herself because everything was written down and the evidence was right in front of them. I looked at her, and there was no anger or joy inside me. I just felt relieved. Emily couldn't control what was happening anymore. Richard demanded compensation, and their golden child, as they liked to call her, fell out of favor. Everything that seemed inviolable in their world collapsed, and they had to pick up the pieces in a confusing turn of events. It was a kind of punishment that they finally realized was too late to take it all back. They tried to blame me for everything, but the words no longer had the same impact as before. Mom left a voice message on my phone, and her voice was bitter, with a hint of desperation that pierced me. "Are you happy now, Lucinda? You ruined your sister's life. I hope you're proud of yourself." I didn't answer. I couldn't even if I wanted to. Her words were like cold rain that leaves no traces, just a wet face. I deleted the message without feeling any bitterness or pity. All I felt was calm. Their words no longer had the power to hurt me. I was free. All that's left is the memory of the past, which I closed behind me like a door that can't be opened anymore. It was my last victory. As for me, I went back to college. I didn't want to be a part of this story anymore, this drama where I was nothing more than a pawn. I immersed myself in my studies, and in what I could control. I focused on building the life I wanted. A life without lies, without falsehood, without obligations to those who betrayed me. I cut off all ties with my family, leaving behind only traces of broken threads. By changing my phone number and email address, I finally broke out of this toxic circle that they had built for me. The same circle that squeezed me every day, depriving me of air and the ability to breathe. But now it has been torn apart, and in its place is a void that I have filled with a new meaning. It's been 2 years since that fateful day when I exposed Emily's lies. During this time, I have changed a lot about myself. I have understood a lot. I wasn't the same girl who sat in the kitchen, challenging my past. I was different now. I graduated from art college with honors. My latest project, whose works combined aesthetics and deep meaning, earned praise from both teachers and local art critics. It was a recognition not only of my artistic skills, but also of the path I had traveled. It was my step towards independence. Now I am 23 years old, and I work at the Harmony City Art Gallery. It was a place I had long dreamed of, a place where art and people merge into one whole harmony. Here I could be myself, create, study, and meet people who appreciate not only art, but also sincerity. And that was my real one. A dream that has become a reality. I felt how life was finding balance, how all the scars that remained were healing. I didn't look for places in my future for those who betrayed me. My relationship with my family was completely destroyed. And although bits of regret sometimes made their way into my thoughts, I understood that this was the only way to liberation. Living without looking back at those who didn't understand me was the only right thing.